Have you ever felt it? That sharp, uninvited sting deep inside your chest when someone else succeeds. A friend lands the job you secretly wanted. A stranger on social media flaunts a life you wish you had. A colleague is praised while your efforts go unnoticed. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow slipping across the floor when no one's looking. A gnawing sensation, a tight knot in your stomach. And before you even realize it, you're not just witnessing someone's joy, you're resenting it. This feeling has a name, a silent, invisible poison that corrodes our hearts from within: jealousy. But here's the strangest part. We rarely talk about it. We hide it, deny it, pretend it isn't there. And in doing so, we allow it to silently drain the happiness from our lives. You see, jealousy isn't just about wanting what others have. It's about believing deep down that their success somehow diminishes your worth. It whispers lies like, if they have it, you can't. They're ahead and you're falling behind. And the more we listen, the more we suffer. Not because of what others achieve, but because of the stories we tell ourselves in its wake. There's an ancient Buddhist tale about a young monk named Rupa. He was brilliant, disciplined, and deeply respected by his peers. But one day, a new novice arrived at the monastery, a boy named Sanda. And to everyone's surprise, this boy quickly surpassed Rupa in his studies, his meditations, even in the affection of the elder monks. Rupa felt something dark swell inside him. At night, while others rested peacefully, his mind churned. Why him? What about me? He couldn't bear to hear others praise the boy's virtues, and the more he fixated, the heavier his heart became. One evening, Rupa approached the Buddha seeking counsel. Tears in his eyes, shame in his voice, he confessed, "Master, I cannot feel joy for him. His success pains me." The Buddha, in his infinite wisdom, smiled softly and said, "Rupa, jealousy is like drinking poison and hoping the other will suffer. It blinds you to your own beauty and turns your heart against itself." And in that simple truth, something within Rupa cracked open. The story isn't about ancient monks in distant lands. It's about you and me, and every one of us navigating this modern world of constant comparison. Today, it's easier than ever to measure your life against others. A scroll through your phone is enough to trigger a cascade of envy. That influencer's perfect vacation, that acquaintance's sparkling new home, even the smiling faces of friends celebrating milestones you haven't reached. But what we forget, and what the Buddha so gently reminded, is that someone else's light does not extinguish our own. Another's success does not rob us of our path, our value, or our potential. In fact, it can illuminate it. You see, jealousy isn't just an emotion. It's a reflection of our deepest insecurities. It's the voice that says, "I'm not enough." And unless we confront it, it festers. It colors our relationships. It dulls our joy. It makes us small in a world designed for boundless compassion. But here's the good news. Within every moment of envy lies a hidden doorway. A chance to pause, to turn inward and ask, what is this emotion trying to teach me? Sometimes it reveals unfulfilled dreams. Sometimes buried wounds. And sometimes it's simply the aching reminder that we've been measuring our worth through someone else's story. The Buddha taught that the antidote to jealousy isn't suppression. It's awareness, to gently notice it when it arises without judgment, to trace its roots, and then to consciously choose joy not just for ourselves but for others. Because when we can genuinely rejoice in another's happiness, we free ourselves. We step out of the prison of comparison, and suddenly life feels lighter. The heart expands, the burden lifts. This is where our journey begins. Not by pretending jealousy doesn't exist, but by shining a light into its darkest corners. Over the coming moments, we'll unravel its origins. We'll learn the ancient wisdom of Mudita, the art of sympathetic joy. and discover how, by celebrating the victories of others, we heal our own hearts. But for now, take a breath, let it out slowly, and remember, your worth was never tied to anyone else's path. There's room enough in this world for all of us to rise, and when we learn to lift others, we too ascend. We live in a world obsessed with appearances, outward success, perfect lives painted in glossy snapshots, but beneath the surface, in the quiet, hidden places of the heart, something ancient stirs. A shadow we all carry, though few dare to confront. Jealousy. It isn't born from the achievements of others. It's born from our own unmet longings, from old wounds we pretend no longer ache, from insecurities we carefully tuck behind smiles and polite conversations. But where does it truly come from? Why does someone else's happiness sometimes feel like a personal loss? The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment and craving. We crave love, status, recognition. We attach to the idea of being special, of standing above the crowd. And when life, in its unpredictable wisdom, places someone else in the spotlight, we feel displaced, as if the world has shrunk and there's no longer room for us to shine. It's not the other person's success that hurts. It's the story we tell ourselves about what it means. A story whispered by an inner voice we rarely question. If they are praised, I must be lacking. If they rise, I fall. If they are chosen, I am forgotten. This narrative, rooted in fear and scarcity, becomes the fertile soil where jealousy grows. In ancient Buddhist texts, there's a striking metaphor. The mind is like a clear pool of water. When envy stirs, it's as though someone drops ink into the pool. What was once transparent becomes murky. We no longer see things as they are, only as we fear them to be. The Buddha identified this emotional poison as one of the 5 hindrances, mental obstacles that cloud our perception and obstruct peace. Jealousy blinds us to our own gifts. It distorts reality, convincing us we are in competition for a happiness that was never meant to be hoarded. And it doesn't stop there. Envy breeds resentment. Resentment breeds bitterness. And bitterness turns us inward, isolating us from the very people who might uplift us. It's a self-made prison, one with no locks, no guards, and no walls, only the stories we refuse to release. But here's the truth no one tells us often enough. We all carry this darkness. Even the kindest, wisest, most loving souls have felt the sting of jealousy. It isn't a flaw unique to you. It's a thread woven through the fabric of being human. The Buddha himself acknowledged this when he spoke of the 3 poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. Jealousy, born of craving and aversion, sits at the intersection of all 3. It is fueled by greed for what we lack, hatred for what others possess, and the delusion that happiness is a limited resource. But what if it is? What if joy, like a flame, multiplies when shared? What if every success you witness isn't a threat to your worth, but a reminder of what's possible for you too? There's a lesson in the story of a humble laywoman named Visakha, one of the Buddha's foremost female disciples. Though wealthy and deeply respected, she never saw another's fortune as a reflection on her own. When others prospered, she celebrated. When they stumbled, she offered compassion. And in doing so, she unlocked a secret most spend lifetimes chasing. A heart unburdened by envy is a heart at peace. She understood that true joy isn't diminished by sharing, that the beauty of life lies not in standing above others, but in walking beside them. You see, jealousy flourishes in the absence of self-awareness. It feeds on unconscious habits and unexamined pain. But the moment you turn inward, the moment you meet that dark voice not with shame but with curiosity, it begins to lose its grip. Not because you force it away, but because you finally understand it. You realize it was never about the other person. It was always about the part of you still waiting to be seen, still longing to be loved, still craving to feel worthy. And when you tend to that part gently, patiently, something shifts. The ink in the water settles, the pool clears, and in its reflection you see not a rival but a fellow traveler, not a competitor but a mirror, someone's light showing you where your own might shine. This is where transformation begins. Not by denying jealousy, not by pretending we're too spiritual to feel it, but by witnessing it, tracing its roots, and choosing not to be ruled by it. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how comparison, our constant measuring of self against others, feeds this suffering. And more importantly, how we can break free. But for now, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and remember this: you were never meant to shrink in the presence of someone else's greatness. You were meant to rise together. It's a curious thing. We spend so much of our lives chasing happiness, running after success, approval, moments of praise. But what if we've been searching in all the wrong places? What if the deepest, most reliable source of happiness wasn't found in what we gain for ourselves, but in how we feel for others? There's a word for this in the ancient Pali language. A word so rare, so easily overlooked, it feels almost like a secret. Mudita. It means sympathetic joy, a genuine, heartfelt delight in the happiness and good fortune of others. Not tolerance, not polite applause, but real, radiant gladness for someone else's joy. And in the tapestry of Buddhist wisdom, it is considered one of the four immeasurables, the boundless qualities of an awakened heart. Alongside loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity, sits this often forgotten jewel, mudita. It might seem simple. Of course, we're happy when good things happen to people we love. A friend's promotion, a child's achievement, a partner's success. But what about when that person is someone we envy? Someone we silently compare ourselves to? Someone whose triumph stirs something bitter in our chest? That's where mudita becomes not just a virtue, but a path to freedom. The Buddha taught that our habitual clinging to self, this tight, unyielding sense of I, me, mine, is the root of suffering. And nowhere is this clinging more visible than when someone else shines. Because in those moments the ego panics. It whispers, "What about me? Why not me? Does their light mean mine has dimmed?" But when we practice mudita, we gently loosen that grip. We train the heart to rejoice in what is good wherever it appears, not because it benefits us, but because goodness itself is worthy of celebration. And here's the paradox. When you feel joy for others, your own happiness expands. It's like lighting 1,000 lamps from a single flame, each spark adding warmth to a world so often cold with rivalry and resentment. There's an old Buddhist parable I hold dear. A poor farmer lived in a village where a wealthy merchant was known for his generosity. Each year, the merchant donated to the sick, fed the monks, and built schools. But the farmer's heart was tight with envy. He watched the merchant's good deeds with bitterness, resenting the praise he received. One evening, after the merchant made another generous offering, the farmer approached a wise elder. "Why should I be happy for him?" the farmer asked. "His wealth grows while I struggle. His name is honored while mine is forgotten." The elder smiled softly and replied, "When a flower blooms in the valley, its fragrance belongs to all who pass by. Would you refuse to breathe deeply, simply because the flower grew in another's garden?" The farmer, struck silent, realized he had denied himself the joy of every good thing, simply because it did not belong to him. That, dear listener, is the cost of envy. Not just the pain of jealousy, but the happiness we forfeit by refusing to celebrate what is beautiful in others. In today's world, a world of endless comparisons, scrolling feeds of curated perfection, mudita is radical. It is an act of rebellion against a culture that profits from our envy. And yet, it's more than rebellion. It's medicine. When we practice mudita, we rewire the mind. Each time you sincerely rejoice in someone else's good fortune, a little knot in your heart untangles. A little light breaks through the gloom. And slowly, quietly, the world becomes a softer place. Not because others have changed, but because you have. The Buddha described mudita as boundless, a quality without end. Because the opportunities to feel joy for others are infinite. A stranger's laughter, a friend's success, a child's wonder, a rival's victory. Each one an invitation to step beyond yourself. To remember that in truth, there is no separation. That their joy is your joy. That the light of one candle can illuminate countless hearts. And here's the beautiful irony. The more you rejoice in others, the more life seems to rejoice in you. So how do we begin? Not through force, not by pretending, but by noticing. Start small. When someone smiles, let yourself feel glad. When you hear good news, say softly within, "May their happiness grow." And when envy arises, as it will, greet it with tenderness, not shame. Ah, here is the ache of comparison. Let me hold it and choose a different way. The path of mudita isn't about perfection. It's about intention, about turning toward the light when the darkness tempts us to turn away. And in doing so, discovering a happiness no loss can threaten, a joy no comparison can steal, a peace that quietly endures. Ahead lies a deeper question. Why do we cling so tightly to comparison in the first place? And how might we untangle ourselves from this ancient habit of measuring worth against others? That's where we'll journey next. There's a kind of quiet ache we don't often speak about. The subtle, almost invisible wound we carry each time we compare ourselves to others and feel we fall short. It happens in a heartbeat. A friend buys a beautiful home. A colleague gets the promotion you secretly wanted. A stranger online lives a life so radiant it stings your eyes. And in that moment, something tightens inside you. A bitter seed takes root. It isn't your fault. This is the mind's ancient pattern to measure, to rank, to grasp for worth through comparison. But what if there was a way to break that cycle? Not by suppressing the envy, not by pretending it isn't there, but by transforming it. The Buddha once said, "Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed." And in much the same way, jealousy isn't conquered by guilt or denial or force, but by its opposite, joy. Rejoicing in others' success is more than an admirable quality. It's medicine, a balm for the bruised heart. When you feel genuine happiness for another's good fortune, something miraculous happens. The poison of envy loses its grip. The mind softens, the heart expands. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you taste a kind of freedom. Think about it. Every day, the world is brimming with moments of beauty, victories, milestones, quiet joys. Most of them don't belong to you. And yet, every single one is an opportunity. A stranger's smile, a neighbor's blooming garden, a friend's newfound love. Each of these is a spark you can choose to warm your hands by or turn away from in cold resentment. And here's the paradox we often forget. When you celebrate others, you aren't left with less. You're left with more, because joy isn't a finite resource. It multiplies in the sharing. There's a teaching in Buddhism known as anumadana. It's the practice of rejoicing in the merits and happiness of others. When a monk receives an offering, the Sangha chants anumadana. When someone performs a good deed, others say sadhu, 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 meaning well done. May your merit increase. But it's more than polite ritual. It's a spiritual act, a way of dissolving the self-centered clinging that keeps us trapped in suffering. When you say sadhu in your heart, you're not just blessing them, you're releasing yourself. And modern psychology, surprisingly, agrees. Studies show that people who express authentic joy for others experience less depression, lower stress, and deeper relationships. Because when you can feel glad for another's joy, you stop being a prisoner of your own. You step outside the lonely cage of comparison. You reconnect to the simple, unshaken truth that we are not separate. Your happiness and mine are woven from the same thread. I once heard a story from a Zen master about a woman named Akiko. She was a talented artist, but always felt overshadowed by a rival painter in her village. Every time his work was praised, her stomach knotted with envy. She believed his success somehow lessened her own. One evening, after yet another public exhibition where his paintings drew awe and her polite nods, Akiko sat alone by a river. An old monk happened to pass by, noticing her tears. "Why do you suffer so?" he asked. "Because I cannot bear his success," she admitted. The monk smiled gently and pointed to the flowing river. "Does the river mourn when the sky is clear? Does it envy the stars for their glow? Each shines in its own way, and the world is made more beautiful by both." In that moment, Akiko felt a weight lift from her chest. Not because she was suddenly the most celebrated artist, but because she realized she didn't need to be. His light did not dim hers. There was room in this vast world for many kinds of brilliance, and she too could glow. This is the healing power of rejoicing in others. It repairs the fracture in our heart that believes worth must be won through rivalry. It reminds us that your joy and mine are not competing forces, that in lifting others, we rise ourselves, that when we open our hearts to the happiness around us, life ceases to be a battlefield of better and worse, and becomes, instead, a garden of blessings. So let this be your quiet vow tonight. When good news comes, whether to you or another, whisper softly, "May it grow, may it flourish, may I find joy in their joy." Because in doing so, you reclaim the simplest, most overlooked truth of all. Joy shared is joy multiplied, and there is enough light for all of us. Ahead lies a deeper exploration, what ancient wisdom reveals about why we so often fall into comparison, and how understanding this tendency can unlock a profound peace. We'll journey there next. Some truths aren't best explained. They're best felt through stories. For as long as humans have gathered around fires and beneath starlit skies, we've passed down wisdom not as cold philosophy, but as living memory. And in the ancient paths of Buddhism, there are stories of Mudita, that rare, golden joy found not in our own gain, but in witnessing the joy of another. Let me tell you one. Long ago, in a forest monastery on the edge of the Himalayas, there lived a monk named Mahakassapa. He was known not for his wealth or influence, but for the simplicity of his life and the vastness of his heart. One day, a young monk named Sumana arrived at the monastery. Sumana was bright, disciplined, and swiftly gained the admiration of the community. Within months, his meditation skills surpassed many senior monks. And with each word of praise Sumana received, the other monks grew restless. Whispers of jealousy began to circle like smoke. Why him? Why so soon? But not Mahakassapa. When the abbot announced that Sumana would lead the upcoming retreat, Mahakassapa was seen smiling softly, his eyes bright with genuine joy. A junior monk, puzzled, asked him, "Venerable sir, does it not trouble you that a newcomer is being honored so quickly?" Mahakassapa laughed gently and said, "Why would the sun begrudge the rising of another star? His light does not dim mine. His wisdom lifts us all." And that night, the forest seemed to glow a little brighter. This is the essence of sympathetic joy. A heart so open, it celebrates goodness wherever it blooms. A mind so free from clinging, it recognizes that the rise of one does not mean the fall of another. Another story takes us to the time of the Buddha himself. Among his disciples was a woman named Visakha, a lay devotee, renowned for her generosity and wisdom. She was wealthy, respected, and deeply loved by the community. But it was her humility that set her apart. Whenever another gave a greater offering, built a more beautiful monastery, or spoke a wiser word, Visakha would clasp her hands in Anjali Mudra and sincerely rejoice. Once a merchant named Sudata, also known as Anathapindika, built the famous Jetavana monastery for the Buddha. It was a monumental offering, one that even kings envied. Many whispered how Visakha might feel threatened, her status challenged. But when the news reached her, she smiled and said, "May merit shower upon him as rain upon thirsty fields. May this act uplift the many for generations." And in that blessing, her own merit deepened. What these stories reveal isn't just about saints and sages long gone. It's about us. It's about the moments today, tomorrow, when you see someone else succeed, when a friend finds love, when a colleague earns applause, when a stranger's smile outshines yours. And in that split second where envy might bloom, you remember these stories. You pause, you breathe, and you choose to rejoice. A Zen teacher once said, "When one flower blooms, spring arrives in the entire garden." Your neighbor's joy is your joy. Their success, yours too, if you let it be. Because joy, unlike gold or titles or praise, cannot be hoarded. It only grows in the giving. I remember once meeting a modern-day monk in Chiang Mai, Thailand. His name was Ajahn Kittisaro. He told me of a time early in his monastic training when a fellow novice excelled quickly in meditation. While Ajahn struggled, this novice attained deep states of stillness and insight. At first, Ajahn admitted it stung. That quiet voice whispered, "Why not me?" But instead of feeding the envy, he began offering a silent blessing each time the novice was praised. "May his peace deepen. May his wisdom guide others. May I learn from his light," and something unexpected happened. Ajahn found his own practice began to open, not by competing, not by grasping, but by softening. His heart, freed from the heavy chains of jealousy, became vast like the open sky. And in time, his peace became as steady as the mountain forests around him. These stories aren't meant to decorate ancient texts. They're living instructions, an invitation, a reminder that every day you'll be given small chances to practice sympathetic joy, a neighbor's promotion, a stranger's laughter, a child's innocent triumph, each one a seed, each one a moment to decide, will I shrink into envy, or will I expand into joy? This is the quiet revolution of the heart, a rebellion against the belief that happiness is scarce, a return to the wisdom that your joy is not separate from mine, that when one heart lifts, the world brightens for us all. And now, as we near the final stretch of our journey, it's time to ask, how do we live this practice? Not in storybooks, but in messy, modern lives filled with deadlines, disappointments, and digital envy. There's a path for that too, and it begins with small, deliberate acts of celebration. We'll walk it together next. It's one thing to hear about ancient monks and noble sages basking in boundless joy for others. It's another thing entirely when it's your coworker who gets the promotion you hoped for, when it's your neighbor flaunting their perfect vacation photos, when it's your old friend announcing their engagement while you scroll alone in the quiet of your room. This is where the real practice begins, not in temples, not in forests, but in the noisy, tangled, and unpredictable landscape of our modern lives. So, how do we cultivate this rare gem called sympathetic joy? How do we train the heart to celebrate, not compare, to open, not contract? It begins small, always small. Step 1, notice the spark of jealousy. The first step isn't to pretend you're above envy. It's to notice it. When you see someone's good fortune and feel that tiny pinch, that flicker of "why not me?" Don't look away, don't bury it, name it. Ah, there you are, jealousy. There's a teaching in Buddhism, What you can see, you can free. By gently acknowledging that spark without shame, you disarm it. It no longer hides in the shadows, quietly poisoning your joy. Step 2. Offer a silent blessing. Now, once you've noticed the envy, pause and offer a simple wish. May their happiness grow. May their success uplift them. May their joy be complete. At first, it might feel forced, awkward, even insincere. That's okay. Like a stiff muscle being stretched for the first time, it softens over time. You're rewiring centuries of instinct, millennia of tribal comparison. Every time you offer that blessing, even begrudgingly, a new seed is planted. Step 3. Reflect on interconnection. The Buddha often spoke of interbeing, the truth that we do not exist in isolation. When one life brightens, the light touches us all. When a friend thrives, the ripple reaches your shore. It's not their success instead of yours. It's their success as part of yours. Remind yourself, their joy does not diminish mine. It enriches the world we share. The next time someone you know reaches a milestone, try this. Imagine their happiness as a bright candle. Now see your own unlit candle being touched by that flame. Notice it takes nothing away from theirs, but it adds light to yours. Step 4. Celebrate small wins around you. We often think rejoicing is reserved for grand victories, weddings, awards, big life-changing events. But true sympathetic joy lives in the small, unnoticed moments. When the barista gets your name right, when a colleague finishes a tough project, when your friend finally sleeps through the night after weeks of stress. Practice noticing these tiny sparks and offering a silent cheer. Yes, good for them. The more you train your eyes to see joy, the more it multiplies around you. Step 5. Turn social media into a doge. Let's be honest, jealousy loves to hide in your phone. Endless scrolls of highlight reels, perfect bodies, perfect homes, perfect lives. But what if, instead of letting it steal your peace, you turned it into practice? Each time you feel that sharp jab of envy on social media, pause, take a breath, and offer a blessing. May their joy deepen. May I be free from comparing. May we both thrive. It sounds simple, but over time, this turns your feed from a source of suffering into a field of practice. Step 6. Surround yourself with joyful people. Joy is contagious. Spend time with those who uplift, who celebrate others sincerely, who find delight in small things. Notice how their energy affects yours. If you find yourself surrounded by chronic complainers or those addicted to comparison, gently limit your exposure. Choose to cultivate a circle where another's joy is seen as a shared blessing. Step 7. Reflect on your own joy. Sometimes, jealousy arises because we're neglecting our own sources of happiness. Take time to reflect. What brings me alive? What am I grateful for today? What simple thing delighted me this week? A heart anchored in gratitude has less room for envy. And lastly, trust that joy is abundant. The greatest lie jealousy tells is that there's not enough happiness to go around. But life isn't a zero-sum game. Your joy, my joy, their joy, these aren't competing for limited space. They expand as we share them. As the Buddha once said, thousands of candles can be lit from a single flame, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Joy never decreases by being shared. Remember that. Let it live in you. And so, as we near the close of our journey, there's one final truth left to explore: why this practice matters. Not just for your happiness, but for the healing of a world starved of sincere joy. We'll meet there soon. And so, we arrive at the final bend of this winding path. If you've walked with me through these stories of ancient monks and modern hearts, of tiny jealousies and unexpected joys, perhaps you've noticed something. This wasn't a journey about others, not really. It wasn't about the colleague who got the raise, or the friend who found love, or the stranger who seems to have it all. This was always about you, about the weight you carry when envy clings to your ribs, about the heaviness that clouds your joy when you believe life is a competition you're losing, about the way jealousy shrinks your world, tightens your chest, and blinds you to the beauty already here, and about how sympathetic joy, this ancient, forgotten medicine, is your way out. Because here's a secret most of us never learn. Jealousy isn't a flaw in your character. It's a misunderstanding in your heart. A mistaken belief that there's not enough happiness to go around, that another's light dims your own, that life's blessings come in limited supply like scarce coins tossed to a crowd. But life isn't a lottery, it's a symphony. And every joyful note someone else plays makes the whole song richer. When a friend laughs, when a stranger wins, when a life blooms, it doesn't subtract from you. It calls you higher. The Buddha knew this, which is why he placed mudita, sympathetic joy, right alongside compassion, loving kindness, and equanimity as one of the four immeasurables. Because a heart that celebrates others is a heart that frees itself. You don't practice joy for others because they deserve it. You practice it because you deserve peace. Because every moment spent resenting someone else's happiness is a moment you steal from your own. And you've lost enough moments already, haven't you? So what now? Maybe now you choose, not someday, not when your life is perfect, not when you feel ready. Now, choose to be someone who notices beauty, who blesses another's fortune without bitterness, who turns jealousy into curiosity and envy into silent prayers. Choose to believe in abundance, in rising tides, in a universe generous enough for all of us. Choose to be the one who says, yes, them too, and me as well. Yes, their joy and mine, blooming quietly in its own time. Because the truth is, there's no finish line, no scoreboard, no final tally of who had more or less. There's only this fleeting, flickering life. And you get to decide moment by moment how to meet it, with a clenched fist, or an open palm, with envy's poison, or with joy's light. So as this chapter closes, carry this with you. The next time life tempts you with comparison, choose joy. When your heart clenches at another's gain, choose joy. When the old habits rise and the voice says, not fair, choose joy. Not because it's easy, but because it's yours to choose. And in that choosing, you'll find a freedom nothing else can give. A freedom older than sorrow, wider than jealousy, brighter than fear. And so, may your days be filled with the quiet, radiant courage to celebrate others. May your heart be light. And may you remember always that joy grows where it is shared. This is the path. Walk it well.